So this morning, once a year, I try to give a presentation to kind of update the church and kind of bring a little bit of awareness of some of the issues and also the trends of things that are happening in our country and sometimes worldwide that relates to our religious liberty. As I've spoken about in the past, religious liberty, in terms of our church's perspective, is really about just giving citizens of the United States specifically, but really worldwide, because we are a worldwide church, the freedom to be who we are without government interference in our lives. And so we advocate as an organization not just for the ability to come to church and worship and come to prayer meeting and things like that, but we advocate for people to have the freedom to make choices as God would have intended for us. Even if those choices don't necessarily align with my views or this or that, we advocate for people to have the freedom to make the choices that are inherently theirs to make. So with what I'm going to share today, there's probably something that I'll say that could be considered political. It's not a political presentation. It's not leaning towards one side or the other. I just want to share some things that I've come across, mostly from Liberty Magazine, but also a couple sermons that I've listened to, presentations on this. And just so that the goal, when we leave here today, that we may appreciate a little bit more what we have and also understand some of the challenges that may be coming towards us in the future. So, there we go. So I want to start out with some things that are happening up in Canada. Some of you may be aware of there's been a lot of challenges to religious freedom in our neighbor country up in Canada. And in 2019 in Quebec, Canada, a bill was passed that bans some public employees from wearing religious headdresses, outfits, and things like that. That's going to include Muslims that might want face coverings, Jews that might want their head covered. It's banned from being wearing those if you're a government employee in public places. And also the premier of Quebec has made a statement saying seeing people praying in the streets in public parks is not something we want in Quebec. I had no idea. Had no idea about that. And so there's a school in British Columbia. Sorry, my slides are not, there we go. Give me just a second to get, okay. There's a school in British Columbia called Trinity Western University. And this is, I'll call it a religious leaning school that holds traditional values that many of us hold. And this school wanted to start a law program so they could, have a law school, and when students graduated, they'd be ready to sit for what is the bar in the United States, whatever the accrediting or whatever, terminal degree for law school is in Canada. And there were several law societies that didn't want this school to have a law program. And the reason is because this school had held the traditional views on marriage and what marriage entailed, and that didn't align with their values. So they sued the state, whatever their government is, that accredits schools, that they should not be allowed to have a law school because they didn't fit the mold of what they thought that the school should teach in terms of marriage. And this went all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court. And the Canadian Supreme Court sided with these law societies in that the school could not have a law program because they did not hold the secular view on marriage. I thought that was kind of interesting because I didn't realize Canada had laws that were strict like that. And there I just talked about that bill. I got my head of myself about the Bill 21. In Canada, you can't wear the headdresses, and that they are looking to not even allow public prayer in certain parts of Canada. So our view on secularism is very different, where some countries, the secularism promotes restricting religion, we traditionally in our country have had this view that we want to promote the freedom of choice. And as Christians, sometimes we might have our interpretation of what that freedom of choice is, and we're going to naturally lean towards religious things. But our country has had some changes in the last 10, 15 years that may not align with our views, but under the First Amendment, which is kind of the basis for a lot of the laws regarding choice and free speech, there's been some changes. And so our church has not supported some of the changes, but we've supported each person in this country having the right to make that choice on their own. That's kind of how God views us, that he doesn't force us to live a certain way, but we have that choice to make. And so religious liberty, as I'd like to share it to you guys today, is not only our ability to worship in church, but the choice to individually make decisions for ourselves as we feel convicted. So, looking at the Supreme Court, a lot of the laws in this country are based on what happens in the Supreme Court. As we all know, if you have an issue, it goes to Escanaba Court, and if you don't like the decision, you can appeal to the whatever district court, and then you can appeal to the larger court. And eventually, if the court's accepting the cases, and you don't like the decision, it has the opportunity to make it to the Supreme Court. And there's been a handful of cases, both in 2024, but also through the last 10 years, that have made it to the Supreme Court that have been very interesting. But a lot of them have to do, especially with the recent cases, with free speech and the ability to be who you believe that, how you feel that your life should be. And there have been many organizations trying to stifle that ability to have your choice. One of the most recent things that's actually going through the Supreme Court right now, interesting to me, is the Supreme Court is grappling with a claim that New York pressured businesses to cut ties with the NRA. So this goes back several years, I think back in 2018 and 19, that the state of New York was pressuring insurance company called Lloyd's of London. You may have been familiar with them. They're a very, very large insurance company. And the NRA was offering insurance to people who had concealed carry permits to cover some sort of coverage, and the state of New York did not like this, as they're not friendly to this type of choice. And so they, through emails and also personal conversations, but made the mistake of putting it in writing, were pressuring Lloyd's of London to drop NRA from their client list to try to force the NRA to not have influence. Obviously, that's probably not the most legal way to get your political ways taken care of. And they were offering to get favorable contracts with the state of New York if they were to drop the NRA. So this case has made it all the way up to the Supreme Court and has not been heard yet, but very likely will, as this is definitely using your legislative powers to try to push the agenda that the state of New York is interested in. So here's, in the middle of that there, this is off from CNN. The NRA claims that the former superintendent of the New York State Department of Financial Services not only leaned on insurance companies to part ways with gun lobby groups, but also threatened enforcement actions against those firms if they failed to comply. So that case is working its way, should be heard by the Supreme Court sometime soon. Like I said, you may like it, you may not, but free speech is something that our country has definitely had, and the freedom of choice is very important. So last year, about this time, I also did a presentation on religious liberty. I talked about this case in somewhat detail, Groff versus DeJoy. And this is that case where the U.S. Postal Service employees, starting in the early 2000 teens, 11, 12, 13, when Amazon started wanting to do Sunday deliveries. He worked for the Postal Service, and his religious day is on Sunday. And he told them, I'm not available to work on Sundays. I didn't take this job with Sunday commitments, and I can't do this. And he originally got accommodations, but eventually was not allowed to have Sundays off. And so it ended up getting to the point where he was threatened to be fired, and he quit, because if you get fired from the federal government, you're probably not going to get another job in the federal government, because it's considered a bad mark on you. So this case went through the courts, and It was decided in favor of him, which was a huge change from traditionally the standards that an employer had to prove to accommodate you or not accommodate you for your religious views. And that was based on, well, first of all, the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s gave us that freedom, religion. It's the same foundation that if you were to be pregnant and have a baby, that you don't have to prove, that it's a minimal cost to your employer for you to get your time off to have your baby, and usually you get your 12 weeks off, FMLA, Federal whatever leave act, medical leave act, that everybody can get real easily. Well, if you have a religious thing, there was a case in 1977 that defined the harm that had to be to the employer as what they call a de minimis harm to them. So in other words, a very minimal difficulty for them to accommodate your request, and if it's anything more than minimal, they don't have to accommodate it. Well, that's been the standard since 1977 until this case came through the Supreme Court that was just decided last spring sometime, April, May, June, something like that. And they found that in this original, this is very interesting to me, that in that original TWA case from the 70s that kind of set the standard, there was a footnote at the very end that said, there was a footnote that said, TWA had done all that it could to without incurring significant hardship or violating the seniority rights of other employees. Well, that was a footnote, and the courts have since that time said that it was a minimal, that businesses only had to give you a minimal amount of effort to get that time off or the accommodation for your religious beliefs, Sabbath or Sunday work. So because of that footnote, the Supreme Court hates changing precedences. So when they have a case that they have made a decision on, that case then sets the precedent for everything that goes down the road. And it was very unusual for the Supreme Court to seem to overturn. Really, they just clarified that said that TWA had, without incurring significant hardship. And so that's now the standard as of a year ago, that if you need religious accommodation, the employer has to prove that it would be significant hardship for them to be able to give you that accommodation, versus before it was like de minimis or very, very little hardship. So that's a very interesting thing. Like I said, we talked about this in somewhat detail last spring, but I just wanted to bring that up. If you know anybody that has had employment issues with regard to their religion, things have changed. That the difficulties it used to have, it should get better with this case. So that was a big case in the last year. So I'm going to move on to a couple of cases that have happened that have really changed government's role in religion that I was not fully aware of, but you may be interested to hear about these because it has significantly changed the government's ability to be involved in religious life, if that's the best way to say it. So there's a case in 2017 called Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. And so Trinity Lutheran was a religious school, and in the state of Missouri at the time, they were offering to take shredded tires. A lot of playgrounds, they'll take old tires and shred them, and it provides a nice surface. It's safe, it's clean for playground bases. And they were offering grants to schools and organizations that had playgrounds that if you wanted to have your playground resurfaced, you could apply for and receive a grant for this. Well, Trinity Lutheran applied for this grant, and the state denied it on the basis that they are religious organizations, so they don't qualify for this playground resurfacing. Well, traditionally, yeah, government hasn't given any money to religious organizations, and honestly, I don't know if we want government money in what we do, because there is some strings that are typically attached. But Trinity Lutheran sued the state for that, stating that this is just a playground, it has nothing to do with religion. Kids play on playgrounds everywhere. Why can't we have the funding that any other playground would have to make it safer for our kids? So they're denied. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, Um, and the Supreme Court, surprisingly, in a change of their leanings, they ruled that although this was a religious organization, that the funding for the playground is not furthering their religious message. And so because the playground doesn't further religious message, they qualified to receive the grant. And therefore, governments cannot discriminate against religious organizations, and for the very first time says, can provide funding to religious organizations as long as the funding is going to be used for non-religious purposes. 2017, that was the first time the Supreme Court had ever ruled to allow money to go to religious organizations using taxpayer money. Well, probably no real opinion on this, right? It's whatever, it's playgrounds, Well, let's move then to, and Sonia Sotomayor wrote a dissent, which is an unofficial opinion, I guess I could say, written by one of the justices or a judge that kind of raises a concern with this decision. And she said, the court today profoundly changes that relationship between church and state by holding that for the first time that the Constitution requires the government to provide public funds directly to a church. This decision slights both our precedents and our history. For over 200 years, our Constitution has held the notion of separation of church and state. And for the first time in our history, it was ruled that the state must fund a religious institution. So let's move to the 2020, another case that went through the Supreme Court, Espinosa versus the Montana Department of Revenue. So Montana had a rule that if you didn't attend public school, that you could apply for and receive a voucher to go to private school. This was cheaper for the state of Montana and gave people some choice. So there were some parents that applied for assistance for their kids to attend a religious school. And of course it was denied, as traditionally we would have expected. So the parents sued the state of Montana, stating that there's no way to prove that the funds would be going for religious instruction, just for them to get an education. And this case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court listened to the case, and they ruled in favor of the parents. And you know what their basis was? Trinity Lutheran from 2017. That the government had set a precedence of supporting tax dollars being used for religious organizations. And so because of that, then these parents qualified to have tuition assistance available to go to Christian school. But there it says that the reasoning was that there was no way to prove that the money sent to the private religious school would be used for religious purposes. Okay, so then moving to 2022 in Maine. Maine had a program where there was parts of Maine where they didn't have public schools in different districts or different areas, and so you could apply to have vouchers once again to go to private school, and a significant amount of money. But it specifically stipulated that you could not use those vouchers for schools that teach or promote religious ideas. So, of course, parents sued, try to get the money, because this is a lot of money available. If you can get a voucher to help go to school, for some people that's what they want. And based on, once again, the Trinity Lutheran and then the Espinosa decisions, the two that we've looked at already briefly, the Supreme Court stated that the government must subsidize religious institutions when it subsidizes secular institutions. So we've gone from cannot, you may, you can as long as it doesn't involve, if you can't prove that it's for religion, to now you have to subsidize secular or religious together. You may have a different opinion on this, that it's great or it's bad. I'm not here to influence that. But this is a significant change in how our government has viewed their relationship with religious organizations. And to me, that is concerning. So they said, the Supreme said, we don't care that they teach religion. If you subsidize secular schools, you must subsidize religious schools. And in the dissent that was written on this case, it was stated, we have never previously held what the court upholds today, namely that a state must use state funds to pay for a religious education. This violates all prior precedent. So we know now that a lot of states have vouchers that are available that can be used for private schools, religious or non-religious. In Wisconsin, if you're in grades K through 8, you're eligible for $10,237, and for high schools, $12,700. That's a lot of money. The catch in Wisconsin is that you have to be at what they call 220% of the federal poverty level, which probably means nothing to us because I'm looking out and I don't see any poverty level. But that's for a family of 4, that comes out to about $65,000. So if you make less than $65,000 as a family of 4, you qualify for these vouchers in Wisconsin. So that's something that without these Supreme Court rulings would not have been legal or available before. So this takes us to the granddaddy of all the cases in this area that's going through the courts right now and is on the docket to be heard this year by the Supreme Court. It's St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School versus Drummond. And what happened here is the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Oklahoma applied to start a charter school, a Catholic charter school, in the state of Oklahoma. Now, are we familiar with what charter schools are? Kind of heard the name. It's schools that are alternative public education that specialize in different areas. So I'm not like well-versed on this, but I know that some charter schools might be music-oriented, where kids that are more musically gifted could kind of start tailoring their education at the high school level. So it's kind of specialized schools. And so they applied to use state funds to build and operate a Catholic charter school. And the School Board of Oklahoma voted 3-2 to support it, based on the prior precedents that they thought they would be following. The Archdiocese stated in their application that this school will teach Catholic doctrine like all other Catholic schools. It was voted and passed by the Department of Education of Oklahoma, forcing taxpayers to pay for this school. The Oklahoma Attorney General filed a lawsuit against the school and their own Board of Education. It was argued in April 2 in 2024 in the Oklahoma State Supreme Court as a violation of the Oklahoma Constitution. So the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled that the state cannot fund this, being a religious, 100% religious charter school. Obviously, this court case is going to the Supreme Court, and it is scheduled to be heard this year. But it's interesting that we go from 2017, where the state taxpayer money may support religious organizations, to you have to support them because you can't prove that they are teaching religion with that money that was given, to now we're applying for the state to completely 100% fund religious education. Taking aside what religion is, that's not my purpose, but that's the case that's going through right now. A lot of change in the way our country has been leaning in its view with the separation of church and state. So depending on how this case comes out in the courts, and I have a feeling, I'm not going to give you my opinion on which way it's going to go, but the case could completely redraw the boundaries between church and state in education. It's raised many concerns for opponents who fear that a ruling in favor of the school would completely redraw the boundaries and threaten religious liberty. And others argue that the court has opened the door to taxpayer money being funneled into religious entities in certain circumstances. And now I'm just going to kind of review a couple other things that are interesting that have gone through in the last year or so. In the state of Louisiana, first of all, in August of 23, in Louisiana, a law was passed that every classroom in the state of Louisiana must display the phrase, "In God We Trust." It seems kind of harmless, right? I mean, we have it on our money already. But That was kind of interesting. But then in June of 2024, Louisiana became the only state in the United States that requires that the 10 Commandments be listed in every single classroom, from kindergarten all the way up through university level. And the reason is that it's a part of their, integral part of their history or something like that. At first thought, it would seem great to have "In God We Trust" and the 10 Commandments in every classroom, but is that giving people the freedom of choice? They're forced to go to school. In public school, private school is different. We have a school here, we have a different set of standards, that's why we have it. But do we want the government forcing everybody to have religious leaning in their life, or experience in their life? That's a decision for you to make on your own, but it definitely brings questions of violating the choice that we have and the free choice that we have that could then be extrapolated into further things. And this was interesting to me. The World Health Assembly, which is a branch of the World Health Organization, the WHO or the WHO, met last year. There's 194 nations that are part of this, and they wanted to pass a treaty that all these member nations would sign on to. And this treaty would give the World Health Organization the power to declare when there was a pandemic and what the response would be from every member nation. That's concerning, right? You have one body telling the whole world what you have to do if they declare a pandemic. Thankfully, it did not pass, but it is up for discussion again this year at their assembly. I imagine that the WHO will keep pushing and pushing and pushing for this. So that's another concerning thing that's going on. Yeah, this is just from their website. Government's progress on negotiations for a pandemic agreement to boost global preparedness for future emergencies. And it says here, this is from their website, the World Health Organization. There is growing urgency for an effective pandemic agreement that does not only prepare us for the next pandemic, but helps preventing it, including via a One Health approach. And then I came across this on the Liberty Magazine website in one of the articles, talking about Project 2025. You may be familiar with it, you may love it, you may have never heard of it, but Project 2025, in my description, is a document that was created. It was created by a group of 100 different partner organizations, strong religious leaning, and their goal with this document, that's like some 900 pages, like every official document is, way more than you could ever read, unless you had a lot of time. It was written by these groups headed by the Heritage Foundation, and the goal was to have a political agenda set in place if their president were to come to be elected during the election that we just went through. So it's not an official document of any religious party, but it is a policy agenda for this group of people. And their purpose was to unify and present a cumulative agenda moving forward into the next administration. So there was something that I came across that was really interesting to me, that this is from page, I think it's 885 or something like that. If it matters to you and you want to read it, you can text me and I'll send it to you. I meant to have the page number on here, but I got rid of it. So it says here, God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest. Until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. Moreover, a shared day off makes it possible for families and community to enjoy time off together rather than as atomized individuals, and provides a healthier cadence of life for everyone. Unfortunately, that communal day of rest has eroded under the pressures of consumerism, secularism, especially for low-income families. Congress should encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. That day would default to Sunday, except for employers with a sincere religious observance of a Sabbath at a different time, such as Friday night to Saturday night. The obligation would transfer to that period instead. I'm going to skip down. While some conservatives believe that the government should encourage certain religious observance by making it more expensive for employers and consumers to not partake in those observances, other conservatives believe that the government's role is to protect the free exercise of religion by eliminating barriers. So this is nothing that's going through our legislation in the government. This is an organization that has this desire to have some of these policies pushed, and this is something that kind of raised my flags a little bit. Clearly, we don't need the government telling us that we need to worship on a certain day, that our employers, if we do have to work, have to pay us time and a half for that, and to create barriers for, we want everybody to have that choice. As Seventh-day Adventists, obviously we honor the Sabbath, and it'd be great if everybody did, but it's not our place to force anybody to do that, and it's not the agenda of our church to force people. So having government influence in days of worship is definitely not in our favor and something we should keep our eye on. So I just want to close with a quote that I found from Great Controversy as I was doing some reading. From page 445. It says, when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and to sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image to the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. And so, should we have, would it be great if we had, in this case that's going through the Supreme Court right now with the charter school in Missouri, would it be great if we had publicly funded Adventist schools? We wouldn't have to worry about tuition and paying for things. Do we want the government to eventually have control over the education of all of our kids without us having a choice? There's been a lot of laws that have been passed recently involving religion in some way or another. Super, super heavy in the last 10 years. And we should definitely be aware. We should appreciate the freedom we have. It may not be there forever, but we definitely should take advantage of the liberty and the freedoms that we have and not let that time go to waste. I want to encourage, in closing, there we go. Liberty Magazine is produced by our church, and as I mentioned last year, its purpose is not to preserve religious liberty for Adventists only. They help people of any faith that are having religious discrimination issues. We feel that if everybody has the freedoms that we should have regarding speech, religion, worship, education, our life, that it's in the benefit of everybody. And so Liberty Magazine, you can subscribe to it if you like the paper copy, but it's free right on the internet. Every article is there. And sometime I would like you to just spend a little time looking through some of the different articles. The editorial, this is from the January, February. It comes out every 2 months. And the editorial from this current January, February issue is The Tale of Two Countries. It talks in a whole lot more detail about the issues in Canada, the directions they're going versus the directions we are going with regards to freedom of religion, of choice, of who you are. And so that's an interesting article. They're not very long. Another one I thought was interesting is this Oklahoma. Is it coming up there? No? Okay, sorry about that. Here I'm flipping through thinking it was up there. I guess because I don't have it on PowerPoint. Is it sharing now, Paul? Okay. It's showing my extended screen, so sorry about that. Oklahoma has created, here I'm just going to read this to you. I wanted to show you guys, but I think for me to, give me a second here, I'm going to get this figured out. Because I want you to see it. Is that there now? Yeah, but I can't see it. I'm going to skip that because I can't see it out there now to move it around. Encourage you to just take a look at Liberty Magazine. If you're looking for something to read on a Friday night, rather than flipping on Facebook, flip through some of those articles. You may learn some things that will help you have a better understanding of what's happening in the government, but also maybe have a different understanding of how people around you who think differently than you need the same freedoms of choice that we have in our life. It's not in our favor for the government to regulate our lives any more than they do, and that applies to many, many areas. So let's commit in our lives to not just sit back and reap the benefits, but maybe keep working towards increasing the freedoms that we have and also taking advantage of those freedoms. Lord, I thank you so much for the freedoms that you've given us. We are blessed to be in this country. There may be times that we're frustrated with the current events and the way things are going, but we still have it really, really good. I pray that we won't waste that opportunity and that we'll use our freedom to share your word about the life that is available with you, but also to advance our personal relationship with you and the knowledge that we have about how you have intended for us to live. In your name we pray. Amen.